Heute bin ich ganz besonders stolz, einen der bedeutendsten und eifrigsten System- und Kapitalismuskritiker bei uns im Kanal begrüßen zu dürfen, nämlich niemanden anderen als den Sprachwissenschaftler Noam Chomsky. 2 Jahre hat es gedauert, bis er endlich zugesagt hat. Und ich habe ihn vor allem eingeladen, weil ich nicht mit ihm einer Meinung bin, weil ich viele Punkte komplett konträr sehe. Aber in Zeiten wie diesen ist es ganz besonders wichtig, andere Meinungen zu akzeptieren und zu tolerieren. Es war nie wichtiger, sich auszutauschen, sich die Hand zu geben und versuchen, das Gegenüber zu verstehen. Und aus dem Grund war es mir ein Anliegen, ihn einzuladen, ihn aussprechen zu lassen, natürlich auch zu widersprechen und ihm hier eine Plattform zu geben. Ich hoffe, diese Folge gefällt euch genauso gut wie mir. Ich würde mich jetzt schon freuen, wenn ihr natürlich ein Abo da lasst und wenn ihr natürlich dieses Video auch gerne teilt mit Freunden, Bekannten, diejenigen, die Noam Chomsky vielleicht noch gar nicht kennen oder diejenigen, die ihm zustimmen oder widersprechen. Also, in Zeiten wie diesen, wir müssen aufeinander zugehen, wir müssen miteinander die Hand reichen und deswegen ist es auch wichtig, andere Meinungen zu akzeptieren, zu tolerieren, versuchen nachzuvollziehen, sich auch Argumenten zu öffnen, vielleicht sich auch überzeugen zu lassen, nie überreden zu lassen und natürlich auch andere Meinungen auszuhalten. Auch das ist ein Grundpfeiler der Demokratie, die jetzt seit Jahren ja leider gefährdet ist, weil keine andere Meinung mehr zugelassen wird. Also, viel Spaß mit Noam Chomsky und am Ende wird es wieder eine Zusammenfassung geben über das, was er gesagt hat. Also bleibt dran, viel Spaß jetzt mit Noam Chomsky. Today I'm talking with Noam Chomsky. He is an American linguist, philosopher, social critic, and political activist, and author of many books. His book, Consequences of Capitalism, is now translated in German. Before we do a deep dive into the book, I would like to say hello, Mr. Chomsky, and it's great having you. It's an honor.
Thank you very much. Pleased to be with you.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask you before we start, you saw a lot in your lifetime. What do you think? What is the state of the world right now?
In a single phrase, pretty awful and dangerous. We're facing, it may be that we are living in the twilight of the human sojourn on Earth. At least we seem to be trying to make it turn out that way.
So what kind of dangers do you see? What's the biggest threat for humanity?
Well, I'm happy to go along with the analysts of the famous doomsday clock, who've now, as you know, put the hands to seconds, having abandoned minutes, 100 seconds to midnight, which means termination of the game. They give 3 reasons. One is the increasing danger of nuclear war, which is basically terminal. Second is the failure to deal with the rising threat of environmental destruction, which doesn't mean immediate collapse, doesn't mean everybody dies at once, but it may mean we will reach tipping points that are irreversible. And from then it's on to inevitable decline, destruction. The third is the collapse of the arena for rational discussion. At first, it may sound as if that is not quite as dire as the first 2, but it is, because that's the only hope for dealing with the first 2 crises. And I think all 3 of those are correct. There are plenty of other problems, but those are the overarching ones.
Is this what you meant when you said, it's a very famous quote of yours, you said, and I use it in one of my books actually, the general population doesn't know what's happening and it doesn't even know what it doesn't know. So is this what you mean?
The United States is maybe the freest country in the world. I think it is the freest country. But it's also in many ways the most indoctrinated. And actually those 2 things are related. The fact that it's a very free country means that, for example, I can say what I want right here, and those stormtroopers are going to come in and drag me away to the gulag and say what you like, but it's marginalized. It's effectively marginalized. So if you look at, the Russians, for example, have a very crude propaganda system. It's very easy to see through it and see if it appears in Pravda, it's probably lies. The United States is much more sophisticated, free societies generally. And it's a point that Orwell made 80 years ago in an essay that was interestingly suppressed. He was found later in his unpublished papers. It was the intended introduction to Animal Farm, which everyone's read. And the introduction was directed to the people of England, free England. And he said, this is a satire of the totalitarian enemy, but don't feel too self-righteous about it. In free England, ideas can be suppressed without the use of force. Went on to talk about it. Well, that's correct. In a sophisticated propaganda system, what you do is present a spectrum of lively debate and discussion. So it looks like everything's being talked about. But when you look closely, that spectrum is bounded. It's all within a certain framework, which is, in effect, expresses the doctrinal system, which allows variation, but not too much. If anyone goes beyond the limits, sometimes something happens to them, but not like in a totalitarian state. They're, at best, they're marginalized. They're, of course, vilified, demonized, and so on, but that's not like being tortured. So it's enough so that people think they're, in fact, presented with the range of thinkable ideas. But as Orwell pointed out, part of the culture in a free society, and in fact, part of the educational system, is to instill into you the understanding, I'm quoting him, that there are certain things it just wouldn't do to say. I think he didn't go far enough. It wouldn't do to think. You don't think those things. They're like, it's what Gramsci called hegemonic common sense. It instills into you the idea that this is the entire framework of ideas. And it's a point that we discussed this a lot in the book. It goes back to David Hume, great philosopher, in the first modern book on what we would call today political science, Foundations of Principles of Government. He opens the book by saying he's astonished by what he calls the easiness by which the many subordinate themselves to the few. Why do they do it? Power is in the hands of the governed. Why do they submit to the government? Why don't they just take power themselves? He says the answer to this must be induced consent, what in modern times is called manufacture of consent, Walter Lippmann's phrase. But this goes back 250 years to the beginnings of the development of more or less free societies, when you couldn't just use force to control people. Hume was, of course, speaking in the aftermath of the so-called Glorious Revolution, England's 17th century revolution, which established the power of Parliament over the king, which gave a semblance of democracy, but it also raised a problem. How are you going to keep the people down? Well, from then we have a couple hundred years of experimentation with this, by now quite sophisticated, and in fact, very self-conscious. So Walter Lippmann, who I was quoting, regarded what he called manufacture of consent as the basic art of democracy. It's the way, in his terms, of keeping what he called the bewildered herd, the population, keep them out of things, make sure they're just spectators, not participants, so that the responsible men, people like him, will be free of the roaring and chaos of the bewildered, the trampling and roaring of the bewildered herd. That was his phrase. We have to be free of that in order to run the world for the benefit of those stupid and ignorant outsiders. He was incidentally on the liberal extreme. The liberal extreme is always the most interesting. They indicate, here's how far you can go and no farther. So Lippmann was the most significant American public intellectual of the 20th century. He was a Wilson, Roosevelt, Kennedy liberal, also one of the founders of neoliberalism. In fact, the term was picked at the Walter Lippmann Symposium in Paris in, I think, 1938 or so. But that's the liberal end of the spectrum. Many others, Reinhold Niebuhr, Harold Lasswell, founder of the modern American political science, Edward Bernays, the founder of the public relations industry, all Wilson, Roosevelt, Kennedy liberals, and all expressing the liberal end of the spectrum of how to deal with thought that we don't want expressed. But you go to the right, it becomes far harsher, of course.
So that's very interesting. You are a very vocal critic of globalization, and with COVID lockdowns and the war in Ukraine, we see how fragile globalization actually is. So do you feel confirmed right now, and is this the end of globalization? Is this the end of the world as we know it?
Actually, I think globalization is a fine thing. It's globalization that allows the two of us to be having a discussion. I don't see anything wrong with that. What I criticize is the specific neoliberal form of globalization, particular form of globalization that was pretty much initiated with Reagan, but really took its most clear form with Clinton. So you take a look at, say, the World Trade Organization, Uruguay rules, which are pretty much the rules of the game now. That's Clinton era. And they're established so as to maximize the benefit for the business and investor community, whatever happens to anyone else. So they impose a kind of business model of efficiency, highly valuable to the rich corporate sector, radically anti-market. A lot of rhetoric about markets, but that's for the public. The policies are highly protectionist. So the one core element of the World Trade Organization rules is the most extreme patent protections in modern history. There's never been anything like it. If there had been such called intellectual property rights, extreme restrictions. If there had been anything like that a couple hundred years ago, England would be a backward fringe of Europe. The United States would be exporting agricultural products, which incidentally is what Adam Smith recommended. Adam Smith was an intelligent person. He, in his Wealth of Nations, he provided instructions, advice to the American colonies. It's the same advice that's given to the developing, so-called developing countries today. Same. He said, use your comparative advantage, which is in agricultural production, exporting fur, get more sophisticated, advanced industrial products from England, will all benefit. Theory of comparative advantage. Well, there are countries who followed those rules. It was imposed on them by force. It's called colonialism, imperialism. So India had to follow the rules. The United States disregarded them and became a developed society, just the way England had, by disregarding the rules. If you look around the global South, there's one striking exception to becoming the third world, Japan, the one country that wasn't colonized and could therefore break the rules the same way the other countries that had escaped imperialism did. Japan brought along its colonies until Formosa, now Taiwan and South Korea, which had developed. That's what we call the East Asian miracle. But it's just the general miracle, if you like, of development. And there's a reason for it. To develop, you have to change comparative advantage. That's what it means to develop. That's why England, hundreds of years ago, stole more advanced technology from India and even from the lowlands, Belgium, and we're now Belgium and the Netherlands, which had more advanced technology. Even Ireland. England stole higher technology from Ireland in wool production. So by the use of force, also England destroyed the countries. Ireland, India was deindustrialized, became India. Same things happened all over the world. So you look at, take say the early 19th century, Egypt and the United States were roughly at the same level. They were both major agricultural producers. That's why Napoleon conquered Egypt. They both had ample cotton, which was the fuel of the Industrial Revolution. The United States, through slavery, Egypt, just an impoverished peasant class. They both had developmental governments. In Egypt, it was Muhammad Ali trying to move towards independent development. There was one difference. The United States had freed itself from England. England was, of course, a global power. Egypt hadn't. And the British said very explicitly in those words, we're not going to allow independent development in the Eastern Mediterranean. And they blocked it by force. Later years, the United States took over and did the same thing. So Egypt's Egypt, the United States is the United States. It's almost exceptionless. It doesn't enter economic theory. So the IMF and World Bank are still giving the same advice that Adam Smith gave to the United States. And it's having about the same effect. Doesn't matter.
Yeah. So somehow we see a historic paradigm shift right now. What do you think? Do we see the end of US hegemony and perhaps even the US dollar? Because it's always like cycles.
There is a paradigm shift now. The pandemic dramatically brought out the severe failures of the neoliberal globalization system. They were there all along, but they became very clear. So the current economic problems, recession, so on,
inflation,
are largely due to the failure of supply chains. You have ships parked in the big ports and they can't move. The supply chain system, the global supply chain system, was designed on a business model, maximal efficiency for the rich, for the investors and the producers, for business, in other words. That's the model. Well, as long as everything's going along okay, it works for the rich. You throw a wrench into the process, it all collapses. Actually, we've seen that in the US medical system. US medical system is mostly privatized. So it's the worst in the world. most inefficient, most bureaucratized, most expensive, about twice the costs of comparable countries, some of the worst outcomes. That's what happens when you privatize and impose a business model. But when COVID struck, there was no spare capacity. Hospitals don't waste space on spare capacity. That's not economic. So no diagnostic extra capacity, no beds. Throw a wrench in the process, it all collapses. For example, there was a study a couple of weeks ago in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, the most sophisticated technical journal. It studied COVID deaths that were caused by the dysfunctional hospital system, not just all the deaths, but the ones you could trace to the fact that the privatized system is totally dysfunctional. They estimated for 2020 over 200,000 deaths 1 year just from the dysfunctional health system. Shows up in many other figures: child mortality, infant mortality, all sorts of other things. So it's a fine system if you're producing automobiles on the assembly line. Something goes wrong, you fix up the assembly line, no big problem. But when you're dealing with human affairs, it can quickly become a disaster. And that's happening now. The whole supply chain, so-called efficient chain, is a disaster. The rich don't know how to get out of it at this point. Let's not keep it secret. What's called neoliberalism is just vicious class war. Has little to do with markets. You use them when they're valuable, you throw them away when they're not. But it does have to do with class war, and it shows. So take the United States, which is the most advanced case, the most important case, and the best studied. The Rand Corporation had a careful study about a year ago in which they estimated the transfer of wealth in the last 40 years to the top 1% of the population from everyone else. Their estimate is roughly $50 trillion. That's pretty efficient class war. And it's duplicated worldwide and under another form. In the third world countries, say Latin America, showed up as what are called the 2 lost decades. 2 decades of structural adjustment, IMF imposed structural adjustment in which everything fell flat. Out of that came the so-called pink tide. And you find same kind of things everywhere. Sometimes it's really lethal. Like in Rwanda, you look back, the 1980s were a period of imposed structural adjustment. It tore the society to shreds. There had been ethnic conflicts before, pretty serious ones, but this just blew them up. Actually, pretty much the same happened in Yugoslavia. The 1980s, there was a period, they were subjected to the structural adjustment programs. It shattered the societies, as it usually does, happening in the United States too. Laid the basis for the horrors that later followed. And these things have consequences. In the United States, or it's just Trumpism, anger, resentment, contempt for institutions, the development of a political party, the GOP, which just wants to destroy democracy and is marching in that direction. These are all consequences of tearing the society to shreds, which is one of the effects of neoliberal policies. In fact, intended. Go back to Thatcher. One of her main slogans was, "There's no society, just individuals cast on the market, trying to survive somehow," which was, of course, a total lie. She knew perfectly well that for the rich, there's a dense society, network of social relations that are very intimate, chambers of commerce, trade associations, actually even the governments, mostly under their control, which intervene to save them when they get in trouble, or just impose harsh protectionist measures. But her statement was half true. Outside the rich and powerful, no protections. Break down the social system, let everybody be sort of out there on their own trying to survive. So, of course, it's a disaster.
So, but we also see like, helicopter money, MMT. We see the government sending checks to the people to, I don't know, to feed them or to entertain them, to play like bread and circuses. Don't we see also like socialism, which is getting more and more trendy and more supported by the governments all over the world? And then we see the central banks as well, and they just print money and transfer it to companies like Amazon and to Wall Street. Isn't this like a bland economy? Isn't this like socialism?
Socialism now means a centrally planned economy. It's not what the term ever meant in the past. That's what it's meant basically since 1917. But if you look back, or since Bernstein and reform and socialism, if you look back to the origins of socialism, it meant democracy. Members of an enterprise, workers in an enterprise should control it and manage it. Communities should be democratically controlled. There should be associations among them. That was socialism. You read Marc, he didn't say much about it. He talked about capitalism. But if you look at what was happening in the workers' movements, that's what was happening. So you go back in the United States, say, to the early workers' movement, the Knights of Labor, made huge labor movement in the 19th century. Their slogan was, those who work in the mills should own them. We don't want to be subjects to masters. What's now called having a job, wage labor, was considered the worst attack on human dignity and rights. You may subject yourself to it temporarily, but only until you become a free person, meaning you run your own lives, enterprises, and everything else. The United States was mainly an agricultural society then, and the farmers' movements were the same. So what's called populism today has nothing to do with populism in the 19th century. Populism was a radical movement of farmers in Texas, Oklahoma, Midwest, organized together, wanted to free themselves from the control of the Northeastern bankers. They would run their own economic system, wouldn't go for debts to the bankers. They'd run their own marketing system. They were working towards what they called a cooperative commonwealth, in which farmers would work together without external controls. They began to link up with the Knights of Labor. If that had happened, it would be a very different country. It would be a democratic society. But they were crushed by force. Then comes a long, complicated history. But these are just the basic understanding of working people. It was the same in England, the same in the left movements on the continent. They were all either crushed by force or co-opted in one or another way, pretty much the way David Hume was talking about. You get people to consent. So now, for a young person, the idea of having a job is the highest goal in life. For a 19th century worker, it was an intolerable attack on human dignity and rights. That's imposition of consent, manufacture of consent, quite effectively. Actually, it never really works. So if you look, say, at the modern period, you have constant uprisings where working people and others say, we don't want this, we want more freedom and control. That happened in the late 60s, early 70s. It's one of the part of the background for the neoliberal reaction. The 1960s were kind of a liberatory period, civilized the country in many ways, speaking of the United States, but similar things elsewhere, France, Germany. And part of it was workers, young workers, saying, we don't want to be subject to the discipline of a master. We want more control. We want more freedom in the workplace. I take part in it. And you get different reactions. So in Germany, you get worker representation on boards, which is a kind of co-optation. In the United States, you just get repression, destruction of the labor movement, mostly by violence. The strikers were crushed, but they keep coming back.
In your book, which is now published in German, Consequences of Capitalism, Konsequenzen des Kapitalismus from Westend Verlag, you ask, is there an alternative to capitalism? So, Mr. Chomsky, is there an alternative to capitalism?
The solution for capitalism is freedom and democracy. Instead of wage labor, which is coercive, destructive, turns people into slaves of masters, we have workers controlling their own enterprises, people controlling their own communities. Now take a look at the political system.
Yeah.
Again, I'll talk about the United States, but it's not that different elsewhere. We have what are called primaries before the election. What's a primary? Take a town in, say, Iowa. Candidates. We have two political parties. They're not participatory parties. They're candidate producing mechanisms. So candidates are produced by the parties. They come to a meeting of a town in Iowa and they say, here's me, vote for me, I'm going to do all these wonderful things for you. Okay, people then decide to push this button or that button. Now just imagine a democratic society, hard as it is to imagine. What would happen is the town in Iowa, people would get together, freely discuss and say, here's what we want for our community and for the world. Then some person comes along, you can invite him, he can come and listen. He doesn't tell you what he's going to do. He listens to you and says, here's what we want. If you can do it, maybe we'll vote for you, but you're going to be subject to our control. If you don't do it, we'll throw you out. Find somebody else, maybe from our own community. That would be a democratic society, almost the opposite of ours. And this is true at every level. Take, say, taxes. Taxes are quite interesting. The attitude towards taxes is a kind of measure of how well democracy functions. In a functioning democracy, what would happen is people get together, say, here's what we want, here's how we decide to pay for it. Tax day comes along, everyone celebrates. We're doing what we want. That's a democratic society. Go to the other extreme, totalitarian society. Some external power says, here's what you're going to pay. Tax day is a day of mourning. You're giving somebody stealing your money. Well, place the United States in that spectrum. It's near the totalitarian end. It tells you something. Actually, if you go to the more social democratic countries, like, say, the Nordic countries, they're closer to the other end, somewhat more democratic. But everywhere you look, you see the same thing. Can we move towards a free, just society where people run their own lives collectively in an atmosphere of mutual support and mutual aid. That would be the alternative to capitalism.
You think it's realistic that we will achieve this world?
You never achieve your goals in human life. You approach them, you move closer to them. So take, say, capitalism. There's never been a capitalist society, never. Only various approximations to it. In fact, if you had a capitalist society really based on the market, it would self-destruct in no time. And that's why the business world has always intervened to try to protect themselves from the ravages of the market. They don't want a capitalist society. They want a state capitalist society where the state, powerful state, which they largely control, intervenes to protect them. That's not capitalism. It's what we have. In fact, just about every society in the world, including China, is one or another form of state capitalism. Only question is which form. So will we ever achieve the kind of society I was talking about? I think we can approach it. And as we move towards approaching it, we'll see problems that we don't see now. That's human life, all of life. You achieve something, you see problems you didn't see before. It's even true of science. You have a goal, you problem, you solve it. All it does is open up new problems you hadn't seen before. It's the way things are. We have limited vision. As circumstances change, maybe improvements, we see new problems. Actually, Marc said something like this at one point. He was asked, what will communism bring? He says, it'll satisfy animal needs, won't satisfy human needs. Those lie beyond. We'll have to face them if we can overcome the destructive forces of capitalism, but they're going to remain. And it's always going to be the case. So I don't think we should talk about reaching ideals, just improving things, maybe improving them a lot, maybe revolutionary changes, which will just bring new problems we hadn't thought about.
Your subtitle is Manufacturing Discontent and Resistance. So do we go on the streets? Do we have go into the resistance to change the system?
Well, if you want to change the system, you have to resist authority and domination. Because at least if you want to change the system towards more freedom, more justice, more democracy. So that involves one or another form of dissent, resistance. So that's what activism is about. An effort to change things for the better, maybe radically so. But there's things in the background which we haven't talked about, but they are overriding in significance. We're facing a precipice. We're going to destroy human life on Earth unless we make some radical changes. And those, given the time scales, those changes have to be made basically within the existing system. The time scale for significant social change is considerably longer than the time scale for terminating the threat of nuclear war or environmental destruction. That's immediate. We have an open window, but not very wide. If we let it close, nothing else matters. We'll be finished. If we're moving on to a hothouse Earth, doesn't matter what kind of social system you have.
Do you expect a big war? Or do you expect a nuclear war?
No, we're playing with fire. Take Nancy Pelosi. One of the most idiotic, lunatic acts in modern history was her trip to Taiwan, taken for the sole purpose of burnishing her CV so she can look just as tough as the most crazy male lunatic. There was no other purpose in it. Unfortunately, China didn't respond very much, but there was no certainty about that. They might very well have responded. If the situation were reversed and some top Chinese diplomat went to Texas and said, we're going to support your secession, the US wouldn't react that way. But we're counting on the Chinese to be sane, so we can be as crazy as we want, cause as much difficulty as we want. We just hope they'll be sane. Seems true on Ukraine. Read the ravings, which is the right word, of the Atlantic Council or the National Endowment for Democracy. Read them. They're the most respected institutions. Read them. What they're saying is, let's tempt the Russians. Let's push for a Ukrainian victory and hope that the Russians won't use the weapons, which of course they have, to destroy Ukraine. Doesn't take much. A couple of rockets could destroy the nuclear power stations. You'd have Chernobyl multiplied a dozen times. But let's take a gamble with the lives of Ukrainians and just hope they won't do it. So let's keep refusing negotiations, because to talk about negotiations, to be a Putin lover, can't do that. So we've got to move towards no negotiations, press as far as we can. Maybe we can press Putin to the point where he'll just slink away quietly in defeat. Maybe he'll use the weapons he has to destroy Ukraine, but we're willing to take that chance because we're tough. So we're not going to appeasement. We're willing to gamble with the lives of Ukrainians in the hope that maybe they won't be destroyed. That's official policy in the West. That's official US policy. It was the policy that was formalized in the NATO summit a couple of weeks ago, where for the first time, France and Germany totally succumbed. Before that, they'd been sort of playing with a limited amount of sanity. At the NATO summit, they gave up. They say, yeah, we're in Washington's pocket. Well, that's the world we're in. Pelosi just dramatized it. Well, notice that the way this is described is China's carrying out aggressive acts. That's called manufacture of consent. What I just said is the obvious truth, but try to publish it.
Yeah, it's a hard time, I think, very challenging times as well. And we see a paradigm shift. We see geopolitical wars. We see Russia, Ukraine. We see Taiwan, China, the US, and everything. So I asked people on social media if they have questions for you. And actually, my feed nearly exploded. They were totally excited I'm talking to you. And they asked everything from how do you start your day? Do you believe in aliens? To will Trump run again in 2024? So I would start with this one. What do you think? Will Trump run again?
Do I think Trump will run again?
Yes, in 2024?
Very likely. In fact, he's preparing for it. Not just Trump, but the whole GOP. Trump has a huge treasure chest. He's been collecting enormous amounts of money from super rich, super billionaires. Remember that for all the populist talk, we're for the working man and all that stuff. These guys just are slaves of the very rich and the very powerful in the corporate sector. There's talk on one side, there's action on the other. You want to find out what they stand for? Look at the legislative program, not the rhetoric. Anybody can stand up and say, I'm for the working man. No. But take a look at the legislative achievements. One major one, a sharp tax cut for the very rich and the corporate sector, stabbing everyone else in the back. Economist Joseph Stiglitz called it the Donor Relief Act of 2017. And for the Republican Party, that's a red line. Can't touch it. They've made it very clear in Congress, can't touch it. Same with the right-wing Democrats who are blocking Biden's legislative program. In fact, today, you see it. Sinema, the last one who's blocking the settlement, just said no raising taxes for the rich. Can't do that. The rich have to be protected. After that $50 trillion that was stolen has to increase. That's Trump. He's the extreme. Same is true of every other part of the legislative program, like eliminating regulations. Harms the population, helps the fossil fuel companies, the banks, and so on, every piece of it. So will he run? So he has plenty of money coming out of his ears. He owns the Republican Party. The rest of the party is terrified of him. They have to shine his shoes because he's mobilized a mass of worshipers. Germany has some experience with this. I should say my childhood goes back to the 30s. I listened to Nuremberg rallies on the radio. I didn't understand the words, but there was no mistaking the sentiments. I get the same feeling when I watch a Trump rally. Worship. There is a difference. Hitler may be the worst person in human history, but he was actually offering something to the German people, overcoming the Versailles humiliation, a moderate social welfare state, which was there, something at least. Trump is offering nothing except I'll stab you in the back and tell you I love you. That makes it a very interesting phenomenon, psychologically quite different from the Nazi period, and it does evoke memories. So yes, I think he'll run. For one thing, he's a megalomaniac. Wants nothing but power. He has only one idea in his head, me, So he has a chance at power, he's going to grab it, and he does have a chance. So I think he'll probably run. If he does run, we may be finished. Because remember that his main policies, apart from enriching the super rich and the corporate sector, his main policies were to destroy the environment as quickly as possible and to eliminate the arms control regime, which somewhat mitigates the threat of nuclear war. He wrecked the arms control regime almost entirely, didn't manage to do it entirely. Pulled out of the Paris agreements, maximized the use of fossil fuels, including the most dangerous, eliminated the regulatory system, which, as I said, somewhat mitigates their effect. Gets back in office, it'll just go wild. So we're basically finished. But it could happen, very likely to happen. In fact, the Republicans are working very hard now. No secret, it's quite open, working hard to try to block the democratic process so that the wrong people don't vote. In fact, what's happening now is really pretty shocking. A lot of it is just under the radar. Take the Supreme Court. This is Mitch McConnell's achievement for the last 30 years. Fill the whole judiciary with far-right extremists who will block anything except the most reactionary policies. Well, by now they've taken over the Supreme Court, a 6-3 majority, so they can get anything they want. One of the cases they decided to take in their next term is an absolutely outlandish case, but look for it. It's called Moore versus Harper. It's a case which they had no reason whatsoever to take up. Nothing came up, but they decided to take it. It's a case that deals with an exotic theory that's been hanging around in the periphery called it's a theory that gives the state legislatures the right to pick electors, no matter who the people voted for. So maybe in some state that has a Republican, let's say Arizona, where I live, Republican legislators, the people vote for the next Democratic candidate. The legislature decides we don't want them. We're going to pick far-right electors. This theory allows them to do that. I mean, it is so crazy that nobody ever considered it in the past. It actually has some constitutional basis. You go back to the Constitution. These were not Democrats. These are people who disliked openly, publicly, opposed democracy, no secret about it. So they put these things in the Constitution, but nobody's ever paid any attention to them. Now the court decided to take them up, might approve it. If they, I mean, because of structural reasons, the extra power of the rural votes, which are scattered, state legislatures tend to be pretty well to the right, mostly Republican. And so they might well decide, well, we'll pick our own electors. End of formal democracy. Goes beyond that. One of Trump's last acts in power was to pass, issue a presidential directive, which allowed, in effect, allowed the president to dismantle the civil service. Civil service is nonpartisan. Any democratic society has to have a nonpartisan civil service. Bureaucrats who just run things, no matter who's in power. Every society works like that. Well, go back to the 19th century, legislation was passed to keep it nonpartisan. Trump changed that. He introduced what he called Schedule F, the new category of civil servants picked by the president. And that can be any number. That makes the civil service an agency of the executive. Means he gets elected next time, he can dismantle the civil service, turn it into party bureaucrats. I think you've heard of that in Germany. Yeah. It's called Nazi. Okay.
Yeah.
The Supreme Court would probably approve it, current Supreme Court. These are all things coming down the road. So we have a group of kind of proto-fascists. I don't like to call them fascists, but and you can see it in their interest. So the Republican Party, who do they love in Europe? Orban is their favorite. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, there was a conference in Hungary of all the far-right parties in Europe, many with neo-fascist origins, gathered in Hungary, naturally. The main star of the meeting was what's called the Conservative Political Action Committee. That's the core of the Republican Party. Trump gave a speech lauding Orban, the main television personality in the United States, Tucker Carlson, absolutely adores Orban, even done documentaries about him. He's saving white Christian male civilization, eliminating all these crazed leftists and so on, instituting illiberal democracy, which means no democracy. He's the idol of the Republican Party. They're having a meeting in Dallas in a couple of weeks where Orban will be there and he'll be feted as leader of the future. This is what we see coming. I mean, in the EU, Orban's an outsider, not in the United States. He's an insider. In fact, for the Republican Party, he's their idol. Well, these things are coming. Can't close your eyes to them. And this is not Andorra. This is the most powerful country in human history. It's going to have an effect everywhere.
Definitely, definitely. I'm just sick of this picking sides, left or right, up or down, rich or poor, because I think we're one species, we're all human and we should find solutions together. And I think, personally, the main problem is our monetary system. What do you think about that? Do you think our monetary system is a problem, is part of the whole thing?
Well, the United States is the reserve currency, the dollar. And the US has been using it
As a weapon.
Weapon against Europe. So, for example, when the United States pulls out of the Iran agreement, Europe strongly opposed it, very vocally.
Yeah.
But they obey. They obey the US sanctions, because if they don't, the US can toss them out of the international financial system. The whole world literally opposes US sanctions on Cuba. Take a look at the UN vote, 184-2, US and Israel. But everybody obeys them. Sweden won't send needles to Cuba for health purposes, because it would violate US sanctions. Nobody is willing to act because the US can destroy them through the monetary system. And it's liberals and conservatives. These are bipartisan policies in the United States. Well, how long is the world going to tolerate that? It's a good question. China is beginning to try to move out of it. But one of the effects of the Ukraine war, I think, is going to be to undermine dollar supremacy. If you take a look at sanctions around the world, most of the world doesn't want to have anything to do with them. This is your war. We're not part of it.
Yeah.
And get off your high horse. This is what you've been doing to us for hundreds of years. Don't start to pretend that you're opposed to aggression. So telling Europe and the United States, just shut up, fight your own war. We deplore the invasion. Of course, it's criminal aggression. We agree that that's what you've been doing to us for hundreds of years and still are. So stop the fancy rhetoric. We're not going to take part in your war. You look at the sanctions map. It's Europe, the English-speaking countries, Japan. Yeah. Nobody else wants to take part. They're beginning to move towards setting up other kinds of commercial and trade relations. Something's going to happen in Germany too. I mean, especially for Germany has developed the most sophisticated, successful economic system in the world. The whole German-based system, which extends to the Netherlands, to former Eastern European countries, all closely integrated. It's been extremely successful. It depends on minerals, not just oil, but minerals and oil from Russia. Now, Germany has a choice. Are they going to hang on to Washington's coattails, or are they going to move towards what's been called a common European home? Basically, something goes back to the origins of the Cold War. Is Europe going to become an independent third force, or is it going to be hanging on to Washington's coattails? De Gaulle was the leading spokesman. Willy Brandt pushed for it a little bit with his Ostpolitik. Olaf Palme pushed it. After the collapse of the Soviet Union became a major issue. What's the system going to be? Is it going to be what Gorbachev called a common European home from Lisbon to Vladivostok with no military alliances? Or is it going to be the continuation of the Atlanticist framework, NATO-based, US in charge? Well, the US managed to win that struggle, but now it's becoming desperate. Is Europe going to be willing to go into permanent decline to stay subordinated to the United States? Or is it going to try to move somehow towards cooperation? And there's a lot at stake for Europe. It's not just Russian minerals, it's the China market. The Belt and Road Initiative huge development program all through Central Asia. Is Europe going to say, okay, we're going to stay out of that because we want to follow Washington's orders? My guess is not for long. I think we're going to see changes take place. Putin's invasion was not only criminal, but utterly stupid. I mean, he had opportunities to pursue tentative initiatives by Macron, Schmidt, not very strong, but at least some initiatives saying, let's try to work this out. Instead, he decided to invade and give Washington on a silver platter the greatest gift it could have, Europe hanging on to its coattails. I rather suspect that's not going to last.
So you think Europe and Germany will look east, not to the US? So this will be the big change in the future.
It would be a change.
Yeah.
It's the east all the way to China.
Yeah.
And the whole East Asian huge growth system. I don't think Europe's going to give up on that.
No.
China's already the main export market for the European countries.
Yeah.
Investment opportunities, the Belt and Road Initiative is integrating the whole of Central Asia. Russia is a crucial part of it. Can't get to it except through Russia. It's extending to Africa. It's even extending to Latin America. The United States is fighting hard to try to block it. All the talk about encircling China, stopping Chinese aggression, it's all an effort to try to block the Chinese-based growth and development system. It's very interesting to look at the United States carefully. Forget the manufacture of contempt for a minute. All the talk about democracy and authoritarianism, forget all that. It's garbage. And look at the facts. So the United States, of course, it's the richest, most powerful country in history, has enormous advantages, but it's tearing itself apart in many ways, kind of ways we've talked about. One of the ways is the whole infrastructure is collapsing.
Yeah.
Bridges are falling, the subways don't run. So you have to Congress wanted to pass an infrastructure bill, which the country badly needs. They managed finally to pass it. Notice what it was called, the China Competition Bill. The only way you can build bridges in the United States is saying we have to compete with China. It's insane.
It is.
You know, it's clinical insanity. Same with the chip production. The United States gave up production, not the United States, the corporate sector realized they could make more money by producing chips elsewhere. So the United States doesn't have a chip industry. Well, the government, Congress tried to pass it, the China Competition Bill. Not we need chips, you know. I mean, notice this goes way back. You go back to 1950 when the Cold War was starting. I would really advise people to read carefully the internal documents, declassified internal documents, like NSC 68, it's the main document. 1950, it's the document that led to the huge expansion of military spending and so on. Look at the rhetoric. Why do we have to have it? It reads like a fairy tale, children's fairy tale. On the one side, there's ultimate evil, the Kremlin conspiracy to take over the world, to destroy freedom everywhere. Their innate nature is such that they can't help from doing this. Utter satanic monsters. On the other side is absolute perfection, but full of love for everyone, do nothing except for the benefit of mankind. You think I'm exaggerating? Read it. It's worse than what I'm saying.
Yeah.
This is deeply rooted in the psyche of the ruling class, the dominant class. You see it all the way through. Even as a name, it's called American exceptionalism. Nothing to do with the facts, of course. But that's just, and you see it today. So you read rhetoric in the West. It's not just a war about Ukraine. It's a war of democracy against authoritarianism. If we don't win this war, Putin's going to conquer all of Europe. In fact, Adam Schiff, Democrat, the head of the House Intelligence Committee, serious liberal, says, in these words, we have to stop them in Ukraine or they're going to be coming here. Yeah, exactly how are the Russians going to be landing in Washington? This is insanity, but it's the country. It's the psychology of the elites. You can read it in the main documents, you can read it in the commentary. It's kind of on a par with saying, let's fight to the last Ukrainian and hope that Putin's not going to destroy Ukraine, as of course he can. It's just hope. It's all of a piece. That's what we're struggling in. And anyone who tries to say it, even Henry Kissinger, voice of sanity, Putin lover, Eastman, Chamberlain, I don't know. That's effective propaganda. Debate. If you want to hear this said, read Foreign Affairs, the journal of the establishment. There they can get away with saying mildly, not in the way I'm saying it, but they can say, look, it might be sensible to look for a way out, and they don't get demonized. But if anyone says it's straight, you're out.
Yeah, but that's for the last years, we see there is no discussion possible anymore. It's either you're on my side or you're my enemy. We saw this with COVID. We saw this with the vaccinations. We saw this with Russia, and we see it with China as well, of course. So there was also the most popular question my follower had actually to you was, please ask him last year. Last year, you said in an interview, unvaccinated people should remove themselves from society. Would you still make this statement?
I wouldn't make it now, and I didn't make it then. I didn't say they should remove themselves from society. I said they should observe restrictions.
Okay.
So if you don't want to get vaccinated, that's your business. But if some store or restaurant or hospital puts up conditions saying you can't come in here unless you're vaccinated, have the decency to respect it. Okay. In that respect, you separate yourselves from society. If you don't have the decency to respect it, there's something wrong with you. Yes, I'd say that now, and I'd say it then. If somebody who isn't doesn't want to be vaccinated, okay. But then if a hospital says you can't come in here to visit your friend, observe that rule. You're not a super elite person who can do anything they want. Other people have a right to protect themselves from you. So you do what you like, but other people have a right to protect yourself. You're not super privileged. So I'd say the same thing.
Okay. And aren't you alerted about the restrictions politicians implemented in the last couple of years because of COVID and other things, like democracies like Canada or New Zealand, which did a total lockdown and cut it actually the ability to move and everything? Because this is like you wrote in your book, manufacturing consent. It's actually the opposite, isn't it?
Except for the people of New Zealand, who incidentally accepted it. One of the things about that differentiated a lot of Asia from Europe and the United States is actual consent, not manufactured. That's why they pulled out of the crisis quickly. So Taiwan, South Korea, New Zealand, Australia did have strict measures. Turned out to work very well. People accepted it. They said, yes, makes sense. The sense of cooperation. They cut the crisis down sharply, very few deaths, moved back to economic, ordinary life much faster. So it turned out to be a wise move, but that's my judgment. What matters is their judgment. They accepted it. Didn't happen in Europe. Take a
Sweden.
look back.
We have to, in
The
Sweden,
United
it
States
happened.
is off the spectrum. But take Europe. In early 2020, Europe had the crisis pretty much in control in the early days. But then the Germans, and Swedes and others decided they wanted to have their vacations. So they forgot all the restrictions, went off for vacations, mixed together, full, huge increase in infections. That's what happens. You want to go to a rock concert with everybody? You want to go to the beach and take it? Okay, fine. You're going to get infections. And Europe doesn't have the crisis under control. Well, it's your choice.
But we have the
You
same.
that way? Sure. Not my business.
Yeah, but
I don't know what I think.
Yeah.
I think the New Zealand approach was the right one.
But
Notice
if you,
that there's a lot of criticism of China now, full of criticism. Well, maybe the criticism is justified, but there is a small point that we might consider. The total number of deaths in China is less than a week in the United States.
but can we trust the numbers from China? I don't know. I wouldn't.
Yes, we can trust the numbers because they come from the leading Western analysts, the Johns Hopkins School, which monitors them. Yeah, we can trust it. Maybe not in total detail, but certainly the general picture. I don't see any reason to deny what's produced by the major Western institutions of medical analysis. And what they show is that deaths in China, that China has saved millions, probably tens of millions of people from death. It's not a small thing. Actually, I might say this is not the only case. Let's go back to Maoist China. Totally demonized. A lot of horrible things happened, like the Chinese famine, the Cultural Revolution. The West relishes in it. There's a small fact that doesn't get mentioned. As compared with India, democratic capitalist India, from 1949 independence up until 1979, start of the reforms in China. China saved 100 million people as compared with India. Why? How? By rural health and rural development programs. 100 million people is not a small number. So yeah, and that's counting the Great Famine, incidentally. We have good evidence from this. The main person who studied it is Amartya Sen, Nobel laureate in economics, the leading specialist on these issues. Anybody care? Can't say it. In fact, it's kind of interesting. Sen's first article on this was in the Daedalus, the Journal of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, leading, mostly liberal intellectual journal. The article had two parts. Part of it was criticism of the Maoist crimes. The other part was pointing this out. Guess which part anyone has ever referred to, except me. I quoted the other part. He then later developed it further in a book with one of India's leading economists, John Dres, who worked out the details. And I wrote about it. Nobody else can mention it. Well, it's kind of interesting because there's a very famous book called The Black Book of Communism, all over the place. It says communism is guilty of 100 million deaths, mostly based on very weak evidence, but omitting the fact that India alone caused 100 million deaths as compared with China by not instituting rural health and development programs. It's not an insignificant fact about modern history, just as it's not an insignificant fact that China's harsh authoritarian policies saved a huge number of lives. Maybe they're wrong, but let's tell the truth about it at least.
Yeah, we had a big leap as well, and we had also million of people who died in the China communist era. And yeah, okay, everybody has to check their facts. But if you, for example, check the cases in New Zealand right now, they're on the highest level ever. And this country was in, I think, 2 lockdowns, and they have the highest vaccination rate. Or if you look at Sweden, they didn't have any measurements, no masks, and no mandatory for vaccines, and they have the same numbers actually. So something doesn't add up. But
they did much worse than Norway or Denmark. And Sweden finally turned to pretty much the same measures. And it's not much of a comparison. Sweden's not a densely populated country, and it's a cooperative country. People do sensible things. Okay? But if you look back at the record, it was worse than the other Nordic countries. And in fact, they've pretty much abandoned it. But this is a different issue. You want to argue about whether lockdowns are right? Okay, argue it in the medical journals. Don't argue it with me. I don't decide on it. It happens that every National Academy of Science, every National Professional Journal of Science, every national health system agrees that you should have heavy vaccination and do things like masks. You think they're wrong? With them.
Yeah, I think some people are frustrated that they have like 3 or 4 shots and still get corona or COVID. Yeah, but this is another topic. So
same with flu, same with tetanus. There are many cases where you have to take repeated vaccinations.
Yeah, but we have no lockdown.
I do. But if you live in the city, you don't have to get tetanus vaccinations. If you're a workman working out in the fields, you have to get them regularly, and you don't complain about it and say, oh, I took it 2 years ago, I don't want it. At least if you're sane.
Yeah, but we don't have lockdowns and other measurements with tetanus or with the flu.
Right.
So
because we didn't have this pandemic before. If you want millions of people, I mean, it's already estimates that the deaths have come to probably close to 20 million. You want to build it up to 50 million, complain and forget about all this. Or if you think it's all wrong, plenty of medical journals where you can argue about it. You don't have to discuss it.
Future will tell us one day. So there's another question from one user. He asked, please ask him if socialism ever will work, because I think it never worked so far, and the weakest part of it is always the human being. So that's the question.
Where was socialism tried and failed? Can you name a place? Can't think of one. We have one or another form of state capitalism everywhere. Nothing like a society where the workers own enterprises, democratic control of communities. That's a remote ideal. So I can't think of a single place where socialism's failed. Actually, I can't think of a single place where capitalism's failed, because it's never been instituted. Can't have capitalist societies and destroy themselves in 5 minutes, as we said before. So there's been elements of capitalism. For example, the neoliberal period, let's compare something real. From the end of the Second World War till now, the Western state capitalist societies have basically had 2 phases. First phase is, it's called regimented capitalism. In the United States, New Deal style capitalism, basically a form of social democracy with fair amount of government regulation. greatest growth period in American history. No financial crises. Financial institutions were regulated. That's the first period. Second period is the neoliberal period, the $50 trillion highway robbery by the very rich, one after another financial crisis, each worse than the last because they're unregulated. As soon as there's a financial crisis, they don't suffer from it. You go to the friendly taxpayer who bails you out. So no problem.
True.
The IMF had a study a couple of years ago of the profits of the main American banks, mostly the government insurance policy, not just the bailouts. That's a small part of it. Financial institutions can get cheap money, high credit risk, good credit risks, plus the insurers know they're going to be bailed out by the taxpayer. Gives them a huge shot in the arm. Goldman Sachs can make a very risky investment, which will be very profitable. Something goes wrong, all on the friendly taxpayer. So yeah, that's what's called capitalism.
Robbery. I call it robbery.
The second period has been highway robbery. Working people, their real wages are about what they were in 1979. Meanwhile, benefits have declined. The workers become much more precarious. People are like Thatcher and Reagan wanted. They're out on the market somewhere trying to survive. So that's two stages of state capitalism. You can talk about those, but you can't talk about capitalism, you can't talk about socialism, because they never existed.
So you don't think like
fact,
when it's
take a look at the so-called, what are called, so take Russia and its domains. We're told all the time it was a huge failure. Really? Take a look at Russia for the last 500 years. From the 15th century until 1917, Russia was a very poor peasant society, declining relative to the West. There was growth and development, mostly foreign owned. Railroads, the French owned them. There was a high culture, but that's true of the third world all over the place. It was different from other third world countries and had a huge army. That was a difference. Other than that, declining peasant society. It went through two major wars. Stalin's purges, became an industrial society, leading industrial society. It's not the third world. Is that a failure? No. Take a look at its satellites, like Bulgaria. It's been studied by Western economists. 1940, the Bulgarian peasants were using wooden plows. It was a poor peasant society. A couple of decades later, they're assembling electronic equipment. Compare it with, say, Guatemala, El Salvador. What do you see there? Okay, which is a failure? I mean, let's be serious. Yeah, it was a rotten society. It's been opposed to Leninist autocracy since I was a teenager. It was a disaster. But you can't call it an economic failure.
Yeah. So I always think money is the problem. The monetary system is the problem. In the last couple of years, with the last great financial crisis, something new came up. So there's one question from our community. What's your take on the cryptocurrency Bitcoin?
I'm no specialist on it.
Yeah,
but I'm
but philosophy
sure
and yeah.
My feeling is it's a scam. I think it's going to collapse and hurt plenty of people. It's already doing it. But don't ask my opinion. I'm no specialist on it.
Okay, yeah, but you also see the need for a perhaps better monetary system, which is more fair, more democratic, which is helping the people and not robbing them more.
Yeah, sure. Very concrete suggestions. Take
Yeah.
the United States, country I know best. One very concrete suggestion is to take the post office, which is probably the most efficient system in the country because it hasn't been privatized yet. Privatize it would be as rotten as everything else, but it still works very efficiently. Turn it into a banking system. Let people go deposit in the local post office. It'll work like a bank used to. You go back to the pre-neoliberal period. Banks were banks. Had a little extra money. My father was a teacher, so he had a job. A little extra money, put it in the bank. You want to buy a car, take some money out of the bank, pay the interest, fine. That's not banks anymore. Banks are part of a big investment system which speculates on the market. It's happened all across the board. Like people don't, if you look around the country, you'll find that there's plenty of millionaires. Looks like a very rich country. Plenty of working people are millionaires. Why? Because pensions were abandoned. Pensions were abandoned in favor of IRAs, market things. Meaning you have a lot of money, that's all you got. You get to be 80 years old, your money's run out. Tough luck. So you're a millionaire in a certain sense, except that's the only thing you can live on for the rest of your life. You live too many years, you starve to death. Furthermore, you're tied into the market. So instead of being safe and secure, what you're doing, the first thing you do in the morning is look at the stock market. You're psychologically tuned into the market. You're captured. You're captured as one of these atoms, isolated atoms. It's a brilliant system for destroying the society. Turn everyone into an empty, vacuous millionaire. Well, it ends up with a very precarious life. The majority of the population in the United States says they can't get by from payday to payday.
Yeah.
If anything goes wrong, you're in trouble.
Slaves. They're slaves now.
They have an accident, try to go to the hospital. If you go to the ER, they'll take care, the emergency room, they'll take care of you. But you're going to end up with a bill which you can't pay. Most of the bankruptcies in the United States because you can't pay a hospital bill.
Yeah.
It's a shame.
It's a shame. For one of the richest countries in the world.
$50 trillion robbery and more coming. So it's great for the, they're financial, you can read financial columnists who says, I'm not going to apologize for the fact that we've had tremendous growth during the neoliberal period. Yeah. It's all in China and in the Western countries, especially in countries like the United States and England, which have been the most extreme in abandoning social democracy. And it's a catastrophe for most of the population. But okay, it's good for the very rich, so who cares?
Yeah. So before I ask my last question, would you like to say something to my audience? Is there a message you want to give them?
Well, the main lesson we have to learn has been lurking in the background of this discussion. The great powers are either going to cooperate in dealing with the imminent problems that we face, or we're all finished. And soon. That's it.
Okay.
So as much as you look about anything else, but that's not going to go away. It's like an ongoing hurricane. Talk about something else if you like, but it's coming.
So what's the biggest threat for us? What would you see as the biggest problem for the future which we should address right now?
Your first question. The biggest threats are the growing threat of nuclear war, which the West is trying to incite by the policies that I mentioned.
Yeah.
Ukraine, China, playing with fire, don't care. Let's see if maybe we won't get into a term war. That's one. Second is the environmental crisis. One of the worst consequences of Putin's criminal invasion was to end the limited efforts to deal with the climate crisis. Some efforts, much too limited. And if I reverse them, so now Germany's going back to coal. I mean, it's kind of, anybody's watching this from outer space, and the whole species is out of their minds.
Yeah.
We have a limited period when we can get off fossil fuels or we're dead. So let's have more fossil fuels. Let's open up more lands for fossil fuel production. Okay, that's the second. The third is the closing of the arena of rational discourse. The reflex, which you see in the German press and elsewhere, somebody makes a sane statement that departs from the rigid doctrine, immediately demonized, denounced, lost his mind, so on. Can't have a rational discussion.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, as long as that's the case, we're finished.
Yeah, that's what the society is definitely lacking, that we discuss like we did, and if we don't have the same opinion, we still should shake hands and say thank you for the discussion. My last question is something totally different, and you're born 1928. What is, for Noam Chomsky, meaning of life?
Meaning of life is what you make of it. That's all there is. There's no other meaning. We have this precious gift. For me, it's longer than it should have been. For others, it's shorter than it should be. We can do something with it if we try, but that's up to us. That determines the meaning of life.
And you definitely did something with your life. You wrote books, you lectured, you were active, and you brought people to think about different things. So this is a real treasure actually for everybody. So Mr. Chomsky, I thank you very much for your time, for your books, of course, as well, and for your insights. It was a pleasure talking to you, and I wish you all the best. I wish you health. And if I am as fit as you are in your age, I'm really grateful, and I say thank you, God. So you're a big idol for that, and thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. If I can add one small footnote,
Sure.
the things that I feel were the most important are things that not many people know about. The direct activism with regard to Indochina, Latin America, East Timor, often on the ground in poorest countries in the world, Kurdistan, others, Palestine. Those are the things that matter, not the books, and that's for the West. But there's a lot of other people out there, people who we're crushing and we should be working for.
Definitely, that's very wise words. We should take care about each other. We're one species, and we should find solutions all together. It doesn't matter which race, which sexuality, which religion. We're all the same, and I hope one day we will recognize this and we give us the hands and don't care about what kind of music do you listen to or what kind of sexuality or religion do you have. And I think one day we need one more crisis, and then we'll achieve this goal for a golden
Very conservative.
era. Yeah,
I don't belong to the modern world. Probably the only person alive who's never smoked pot. Doesn't. I'm literally an old-fashioned conservative.
okay, that's interesting. Yeah, I never smoked a pot as well, so I'm straight edge. I'm not into drugs. I don't drink alcohol, and I'm even vegetarian for over 20 years now. And yeah. So funny. So you're conservative, great. Okay. Mr. Chomsky, was great talking to you. Thank you very much. So if God wants to, we will do this again. And was great meeting you, was an honor. Thank you very much. Have a great day. Thank you for your time. Take care, please.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Wahnsinn, was dieser Mann mit 93 Jahren noch auf dem Kasten hat. Ich wäre unendlich dankbar und demütig, wenn ich mit 93, so Gott will, wenn ich es überhaupt lang schaffe, noch so geistig fit bin und mich so artikulieren könnte. Also wirklich Hut ab, Chapeau, Noam Chomsky auf diesem Weg schon mal. Vielen Dank erstmal für deine Zeit. Aber fassen wir mal zusammen, was er gesagt hat. Er ist ein großer Kritiker, vor allem der Massenmedien, weil die teilweise Grundübel der aktuellen Entwicklungen sind. Ihre Macht stützt sich nicht auf Zwang, sondern eine Art Selbstzensur. Noams größte Sorge momentan ist der nukleare Krieg, ist ein Einsatz von Atomwaffen, vor allem zwischen Russland und eventuell der NATO. Ich meine, mit den Entwicklungen der letzten Tage, der letzten Wochen kann man dem nur beipflichten. Es ist tatsächlich so gefährlich wie schon lange nicht mehr. Interessant fand ich aber die Aussage, dass er den Westen vor allem als Provokateur momentan so erlebt. Sorge macht ihm natürlich auch die Umweltzerstörung und der Klimawandel. Eine weitere Gefahr, die er adressiert hat, ist die Stigmatisierung in den Medien von Menschen, die eine andere Meinung haben, wo wir auch wieder beim Thema sind. Da hatte ich ja schon einige Interviews geführt mit Ulrike Gero zum Beispiel, aber auch viele Videos zu dem Thema gemacht, dass eine andere Meinung außerhalb des Narrativs nicht mehr zugelassen wird, dass die Debattenkultur komplett unter die Räder gekommen ist und dass derjenige, der eventuell vielleicht sogar mit Daten und Fakten gegen das Narrativ argumentiert, stigmatisiert wird und in der Zersetzungsstrategie der Stasi einfach zermalmt wird, mundtot gemacht wird, unglaubwürdig gemacht wird. Und das war vor allem während der Corona-Krise deutlich zu erleben und Noam Chomsky ist auch ein ganz großer Gegner der neoliberalen Globalisierung, die seiner Ansicht nach zur Armut führt. Profitieren von der Globalisierung, das tun vor allem die westlichen Industrienationen und ihre Eliten, die immer reicher werden. Da muss man ihm schon eigentlich zustimmen, denn natürlich diese Umverteilung der Rohstoffe aus den armen Ländern aus Afrika führt dazu, dass dann die westlichen Länder darauf ihren Wohlstand darauf aufbauen und natürlich diejenigen profitieren, die in den Firmen ganz oben sind oder halt die jetzt schon reich sind und dadurch noch reicher werden. Und man sieht ja auch, dass die Kluft zwischen Arm und Reich nicht nur in den Industrienationen, sondern auch weltweit natürlich größer geworden ist. Seiner Ansicht nach hat die Corona-Krise aufgezeigt, wie fragil, wie kaputt eigentlich diese neoliberale Globalisierung ist und wie fragil sie ist. Auch da muss ich ihm absolut zustimmen. Wir haben die Risse im System schon vorher gesehen, aber die Corona-Krise hat sie nochmal deutlich herauskristallisiert. Und als bestes Beispiel kann man hier natürlich die Just-in-Time Produktions- und Lieferketten zeigen, die auf Effizienz getrimmt sind. Ich habe Noam dann ja gefragt, was denn die Alternative zum Kapitalismus ist und seine Antwort war: Freiheit und Demokratie. Seiner Ansicht nach ist die Lohnarbeit nichts anderes als Sklavenarbeit, weil den Großkonzernen so viel Macht über ihre Mitarbeiter gegeben wird und die Lohnarbeiter in eine gefährliche Abhängigkeit bringt. Interessanterweise gibt aber der Noam Chomsky auch zu, dass wir überhaupt nicht mehr in einem richtigen Kapitalismus leben, denn der richtige Kapitalismus würde sich sofort selbst zerstören. Seine Vorstellung von einem besseren System, von einer besseren Gesellschaft tendiert wohl eher die zu sein, so wie wir sie in den skandinavischen Ländern sehen. Also hoher Sozialanteil, viel Geld, was in den sozialen Sektor reinfließt, der Staat, der sich um vieles kümmert. Das geht aber natürlich nur, wenn die Taschen tief sind. Er hat dann aber auch zugegeben, dass natürlich diese Änderung der Gesellschaftsform einhergeht mit großen Problemen. Auch Probleme, die man jetzt vielleicht noch gar nicht irgendwie, erkennen kann oder sieht. Ich habe ihn dann gefragt, ob wir gegen das ungerechte System eigentlich auf die Straße gehen müssen und seine Antwort war überraschenderweise nein. What? Er sagte, wir müssen nur aufhören, denjenigen zu gehorchen, die momentan an der Macht sind. Also, da würde ich sagen, habe ich schon einen guten Tipp für euch. Infektionsschutzgesetz, Maske tragen, im Zug oder im Bus, einfach nicht mitmachen. Wenn es alle machen würden, dann würde das tatsächlich dazu führen, dass die da oben nichts mehr zu sagen hätten. Stell dir vor, es ist Maskenpflicht und keiner macht mit. Sehr spannend fand ich aber auch seine Aussage als US-Amerikaner, dass er die Position der USA im Ukraine-Konflikt als sehr kritisch betrachtet, denn die USA hätten seit Jahren Putin und Russland provoziert und würden eigentlich nur darauf warten, dass es jetzt zu einem Nuklearschlag der Russen in der Ukraine kommt, um dann gegen Russland vorzugehen. Auch Pelosis Besuch in Taiwan, dazu habe ich auch ein Video gemacht, gerne hier anschauen, betrachtet er als Provokation gegenüber China. Es geht darum, dass die USA versuchen, Pax Americana am Leben zu halten, dass die USA die Nummer 1 bleibt und Russland und China den USA nicht den Platz streitig machen. Interessant fand ich auch seine Aussage, dass er davon ausgeht, dass Trump wieder kandidieren wird und auch gute Chancen hat zu gewinnen. Er glaubt, dass wir Europäer in diesem Winter schon uns entscheiden müssen, ob wir weiterhin in den Händen der USA sein möchten oder selbst frei entscheiden wollen, wohin die Reise geht. Er glaubt, dass wir Europäer uns Richtung Osten in Zukunft orientieren möchten. Und das möchte die USA natürlich auf gar keinen Fall. Beim Thema Corona waren wir natürlich unterschiedlicher Meinung, das wisst ihr natürlich. Er ist voll davon überzeugt, dass die Maßnahmen, die Impfung und so weiter richtig war. Aber hey, ich lasse ihm seine Meinung und deswegen war es ja auch wichtig, ihn einzuladen und das toleriere ich auch absolut. Jeder soll frei entscheiden, was er macht, ob er Maske tragen will, ob er sich impfen lassen möchte. Ich bleibe nach wie vor davon überzeugt, dass die Corona-Maßnahmen nicht die richtige Entscheidung war und dass der Lockdown die Kollateralschäden massiv erhöht hat. Auf meine Frage, wie er unser momentanes Geldsystem sieht, hat er eine ganz klare Antwort abgegeben, nämlich, dass der US-Dollar eine Waffe ist. Das kann ich nur unterstreichen. Nichtsdestotrotz ist Noam Chomsky davon überzeugt, dass wir ein neues, besseres Geldsystem brauchen. Meine Lösung ist ja Bitcoin. Das sieht er skeptisch, wobei er gibt auch zu, er hat sich mit dem Thema nicht wirklich beschäftigt. Er sieht Bitcoin momentan eher als Scam, also als eine Art Betrugssystem, als ein Ponzi-Scheme. Aber da wisst ihr natürlich, habe ich eine ganz andere Meinung, sehe ich komplett anders. Aber da wollte ich dann nach so fortgeschrittener Zeit nicht mehr mit ihm drüber diskutieren. Auch da lasse ich ihm seine Meinung und wir werden sehen, wohin die Reise geht. Also ich hoffe, das Video mit Noam Chomsky hat euch gefallen. Mir war es wirklich eine Ehre, mit ihm zu sprechen, einer absoluten Legende, einem wirklich großartigen Denker und ich bin gespannt, wie eure Meinung, euer Feedback zu dem Interview mit Noam Chomsky ist. Mich freut es natürlich, wenn ihr es teilen werdet und wenn ihr euch auch anschließt, wenn ihr noch kein Abo hier habt, mit 286.000 weiteren aufgeweckten Seelen hier in der Community zu sein. Also lasst einen Kommentar da, Daumen nach oben, teilt es kräftig und danke, dass ihr durchgehalten habt. Bleibt gesund, bleibt tapfer und denkt immer daran, wegen Menschen, die unbequem sind, die weiterdenken, die über den Tellerrand hinausschauen, die aber auch vielleicht eine andere Meinung haben als du oder ich. Solchen wie Noam Chomsky, mit denen man trotzdem reden kann, ohne sich zu streiten und trotzdem respektvoll miteinander umgeht. Genau wegen solchen Menschen ist die Welt da draußen besser, als wir nur glauben. Herzlichst, euer Marc.